The Bothy at Cairn, Loune. The road north of Ullapool stops pretending to be a road somewhere around the turn for Cailsca. It becomes something older instead, a grey thread laid across a landscape that never once been asked for its permission. Callum drove the last stretch with both hands on the wheel and his elbow out the window, the cold air needling at his skin, grinning like a man who has just remembered what his lungs are for. "There," he said. "That's the last petrol station for 40 miles. You want anything, get it now." Fiona didn't look up at the map spread across her knees. "I want a bothy with a working chimney and nobody else for 20 miles. That's what I want." "You'll get one of those too." In the back seat, Duncan had his boots up on the parcel shelf and his head tipped against the glass, watching the hills come apart into scree and heather as the light thinned. Elizabeth sat beside him, with a flask of coffee cradled in both hands, steam fogging the windows. "I still can't believe we talked ourselves into November," Elizabeth said. "Everyone else is doing this in June." "Everyone else," said Ross from the front of the second car behind them, though nobody but Sarah could hear him, "is a coward." Sarah laughed at that, the kind of laugh that comes easy after 2 days of good driving and worse coffee. She had her boots already laced, sitting in the passenger seat with her pack wedged against her knees like she couldn't wait to be wearing it. "You've been saying that since Inverness." "Because it's true. June, you'd be sharing the glen with 40 Germans and a man selling ice cream from a van. This time of year, it's just us and whatever else is out there." He meant it as a joke. It would not stay one. 6 of them, 3 couples, 2 cars, and a boot full of gear that had taken 4 separate spreadsheets to plan. They had met at university a decade ago and stayed close the way that only happens when the friendship survives someone's wedding, someone's house move, and at least one serious falling out over a tent that leaked. This trip had been Ross's idea, hatched over pints back in September. A proper walk-in, no waymarked trail, 3 nights wild in the far northwest before the snow come down and closed the glens for good. Somewhere to test themselves against something real, before the year folded itself away into offices and Christmas lights and the low-grade business of ordinary life. They parked where the tarmac gave out, at a passing place beside the burn that ran the colour of strong tea, and shouldered their packs into the last decent light of the afternoon. The plan was straightforward enough on paper. 3 days walking a loop through the glens below Cairn, Loune, wild camping the first 2 nights, home again in time for Ross to lose an argument with his sister about Christmas. The land did not care about their plan. It rose in long brown shoulders on either side of them, treeless, wind-combed, empty in a way that the south of the country never quite manages to be. There were no fences. There were no other cars. There was, Fiona noted with some satisfaction, no phone signal at the pass of the second mile, and she made a show of turning her phone off entirely and posting it deep in her pack, so I'm not tempted. They walked until the light went violet, then blue, then that particular deep charcoal that only happens above the 16th parallel in November, and pitched their tents in the fold of ground above a lochlan that mirrored the last of the sky back at them, perfectly still. Duncan cooked. He always cooked. It was a running joke that he'd once burned toast in a 5-star kitchen and had spent the subsequent 6 years trying to win back the group's trust, one competent camp stew at a time. The first night passed the way first nights do. Whiskey passed round at a single battered hip flask, jokes about who snored loudest, someone's torch beam catching the eyes of something small and quick out in the heather that turned out, in the morning, to be nothing more than a fox's prints in the frost. They slept well. They woke to a sky the colour of a healing bruise and a wind that had teeth in it but no real malice yet. And they stuck camp and walked on, deeper into the empty glen, the mountains closing slowly around them like a hand. By the second afternoon, the wind had found its teeth after all. It came down off the tops in long, shoving gusts that made conversation difficult and walking in a straight line harder still, and by 4 o'clock the group had abandoned any pretense of covering ground and were simply looking, with increasing urgency, for somewhere flat and sheltered enough to pitch the 3 tents. "There," Elizabeth called, over the wind, pointing down into the next fold of the glen. "Is that a building?" They stood at the lip of a shallow bowl of ground, heather giving way to rough grass, and below them, tucked hard against the rise of broken rock that would take the worst of the weather off its northern flank, sat a bothy. It was larger than any of them had expected. Bothies in this part of the world tend to be modest things. A single stone room, a fireplace, a sleeping platform if you're lucky, built a century or a month ago for shepherds and stalkers, and long since given over to walkers by the quiet, informal charity of the Mountain Bothies Association. This one had 2 chimneys. It had what looked, even from the distance, like a second story tucked under the steeply pitched slate roof, and a low stone outbuilding attached to one gable end that might have once been a byre. "That's not on the map," Duncan said, squinting at it. "Older maps might have it," Callum said. "Some of these estate buildings never made it into the modern surveys. Old hunting lodge, maybe, gone to a bothy when the estate stopped using it." Ross was already moving, half jogging down the slope with his pack thumping against his back, delighted at the prospect of 4 solid walls between him and the wind. "I don't care what it used to be. I care that it isn't blowing a gale inside of it." Up close, the building had a particular weathered dignity of a structure that had been standing for a very long time and expects to go on doing so regardless of what anybody thinks about it. The walls were thick, dry stone construction under a hard render gone the colour of old bone, and the door, a heavy plank thing, black with age and studded with iron, swung inward on hinges that had clearly been oiled some time in the last decade, which struck Sarah strange, out here, so far from anywhere. "Somebody looks after this place," she said, running a hand along the door frame. Inside, it opened into a single long room with a fireplace on each end, a scattering of simple furniture, a table, some benches, a stack of dry firewood that somebody, at some point, had gone to real trouble to leave behind, and a ladder up to what proved to be a sleeping loft under the eaves, floored in wide old boards, big enough for all 6 of them and then some. There was a bothy book on the table, the kind every bothy keeps, a battered notebook where walkers log their stay and leave a few lines for whoever comes next. Callum flicked through it while the others got the fire going, and found the entries thinning as they went back. Full, chatty pages from the summer months, walkers grumbling about midges and thanking the last visitor for the dry wood, and then, as the pages went further back into autumn, the entries grew shorter, sparser. A few simply read, "Stayed the night, nothing to report," in a hand that grew visibly less steady each time it appeared, as though the writer had been on something of a hurry to finish the sentence. He didn't mention this to the others. It was, he told himself, nothing. People get spooked by empty places. There was all the Bothy really was, an empty place that other people had briefly, temporarily, made less empty. The last entry, dated some 6 weeks earlier, said only, "Heard something outside. Did not investigate. Advised the same." Callum closed the book and put it back on the table and said nothing. Outside, the wind had begun to carry rain in it, hard little pellets of sleet that tickled against the small, deep-set windows like fingernails, and the 6 of them settled in for the evening the way people do when they've found shelter and intend to be grateful for it. Food cooked on the smaller of the 2 fires, the whiskey flask going round again, boots steaming gently on the hearthstones, laughter coming easy now that the wind was something happening to somebody else, on the other side of 2 feet of good Highland stone. They did not think of the entry in the Bothy book again. Not yet. They talked long into the evening, the way people do on the 3rd night of a trip, when the outside world has finally receded far enough that the only news worth discussing is each other's. Ross told the story, again, of the time he nearly got over a cornice in the Cairns, embellishing a little further with each retelling until Sarah rolled her eyes and told him he'd been about 4 feet from the edge, not 40. Elizabeth and Duncan argued good-naturedly about whose turn it was to cook breakfast. Fiona fell asleep sitting upright against the wall, with her mug still in her hand, and Callum took it gently from her fingers before it could spill, and nobody thought anything more of the wind outside than other than it was loud and cold and entirely ordinary, none of their concern. They banked the fire low, laid out sleeping bags on the loft boards, and by 10:30 at the Bothy at Cairn Loune held 6 sleeping people, and the particular deep quiet that only comes when a building has outlasted every single person who ever built it. It was Lisbeth who woke first. She lay very still in the dark for a long moment before she understood what had woken her, because at first there was nothing, only the wind, only the tick of sleet on a small windows below, only Duncan's slow breathing beside her. Then she heard it again. A scrape, low, at the level of the door, a dragging sound like something heavy and hard being drawn across old wood, followed by a pause, and then a scrape again, patient, unhurried, as though whatever was making it had all the time in the world and knew, somehow, that it did. She lay rigid, listening, telling herself it was a branch, that there wasn't a tree for 2 miles in any direction. She told herself it was the wind working at a loose shutter, though the sound had the weight of it that wind does not have. She told herself 3 or 4 more times that it was nothing, and each time the scrape came again to disagree with her. Something struck the door. Not a knock, nothing so polite as a knock, a single heavy impact, low down near the base, hard enough that she felt it through the floorboards of the loft, and then a long, dragging scratch that climbed the full height of the door from bottom to top. The sound of something enormous testing the wood the way a cat tests a scratching post, except no cat on this earth left a mark that took that long to make, that dragged with as much unhurried weight behind it. Lisbeth reached out in the dark and gripped Duncan's arm. He woke instantly, the way people do who have spent enough nights indoors to trust their instincts more than their comfort, and lay still beside her, listening. The scratching stopped. For a long moment there was only wind. Then, low, from just the other side of 2 feet of stone and 1 door of ancient studded oak, came a sound that neither of them could afterward describe to their own satisfaction. A breath, long and slow and enormous, drawn in and held, as though something very large had pressed its face close to the gap beneath the door and was simply, patiently, smelling the 6 of them inside. Nobody in the Bothy slept that night. Dawn came grey and reluctant, the light seeping in through the small windows like something poured rather than risen, and by the time it was properly light enough to see, all 6 of them were awake, dressed and standing in a loose, silent half-circle just inside the door, nobody quite willing to be the one who had to open it. It was Callum, in the end, who lifted the heavy iron latch. The door swung inward on well-oiled hinges, and the cold morning air came in with it, sharp and wet and smelling of wet stone and heather, ordinary in every way, except for the door itself. The gouges started at knee height and ran the full length of the door, 4 parallel channels driven so deep in the old oak that in places it had gone clean through to daylight beyond. Splinters curling outward with each groove, like something had raked its claws through the wood in a way that a man might drag his fingers through wet sand. At the top of each gouge, where the marks ended, the wood was crushed and split outward, as though whatever had made them, at last, driven down with its full weight behind the motion. Duncan crouched and laid his own hand flat against the lowest mark, spreading his fingers as wide as they would go. His hand did not come even close to spanning the width between the outer 2 grooves. "That's not a deer," he said quietly. "That's not anything I know." Nobody answered him for a moment. Sarah had gone very pale and was standing with her arms wrapped tight around herself, staring at the door as though it might start speaking. Fiona had her phone out of habit, taking a photograph nobody would ever be able to show anyone, and her hand was not quite steady enough to hold still. Ross stood in the doorway itself, one hand braced against the frame, looking out at the empty white slope beyond as though daring something to be standing on it. "Wolf," he said, without much conviction. "Big wolf. Maybe there's a private collection somewhere, and escaped." "There's no wolves in Scotland, Ross," Lisbeth said. There haven't been wolves in Scotland for 300 years. Well, something made this. Yes, said Callum, very quietly, still crouched by the door with his fingers an inch from the wood, not quite willing to touch it. Something did. They stood there for a while longer in the cold doorway, the six of them, looking at 4 ruined lines in ancient oak, and none of them said the thing that all of them were thinking, which was that whatever made these marks had not been trying to get through the door out of curiosity. It had been trying to get through the door because it wanted what was on the other side of it, and it had not, in the end, succeeded only because the door had barely held. Right, Ross said, eventually, straightening up and clapping his hands together in the cold. Right, well, we're not staying to find out what it wants for round 2. We pack up, we get out, we're back in the car by dark. There was a general relieved agreement. Whatever had come that night, the sensible response, the only response really, was distance, and plenty of it. And all 6 of them set about breaking camp with speed and thoroughness that the previous 2 mornings had entirely lacked. Sleeping bags were stuffed rather than rolled. Nobody stopped for a second cup of coffee. Within 20 minutes, they stood outside the Bothy, packs shouldered, ready to walk the 11 miles back to the cars in a single determined push. That was when the weather told them no. It had been building all through the packing, the wind rising in pitch, the sleet thickening into something with more purpose to it. But it was the only once that they were properly outside, exposed on the open slope above the Bothy, that they understood how bad it had actually become. The wind came off the tops in a solid wall, 40 miles an hour and gusting harder, carrying rain that was not quite rain and sleet, that was not quite sleet, but a freezing, half-formed driving mess that found the gap at every collar and cuff within 100 yards and turned exposed skin numb within minutes. Visibility dropped to perhaps 30 feet. The path they had walked in on, never much more than a suggestion in the heather to begin with, vanished entirely beneath standing water and wind-flattened grass. Fiona, in the lead, made it perhaps 200 yards up the slope before she stopped, turned back, and had to shout to be heard over the wind at all. We can't even do 11 miles in this. We'll be hypothermic in an hour." She was right, and everyone standing there soaked through in the first 10 minutes of trying knew that she was right. This was not weather to be walked through. This was weather that killed experienced hill walkers every single year in this country, quietly and efficiently, without any malice at all beyond the simple physics of a human body losing heat faster than it can make it. Whatever had scratched at the door in the night was, for the moment, a problem that could wait, because the wind and the sleet was a problem that could not. Soaked, freezing and beaten, the 6 of them turned around and went back inside the Bothy that something enormous had spent half the night trying to break into. Nobody said very much, not for a while after that. They built the fire up higher than they had the night before, stripped off the worst of the wet gear and hung it steaming from every available hook and rafter, and sat close to the flames in silence that had very little to do with the cold. It was Duncan who finally said what everyone had been avoiding. "We're not getting out today," he said. "Not in this. Whatever's out there, we're stuck with it for at least one more night." The day crawled by in the particular grey misery of people trapped somewhere they no longer trust, watching weather through small windows that refuse, hour after hour, to improve. By early afternoon, with no change in the storm, and the light already beginning its slow winter retreat, restlessness had begun to win out over caution. It was Ross who first floated the idea, half joking at first, the way people do when they're trying to talk themselves into something they already suspect is a bad idea. "We could just go out and have a look, bang some pots together. Whatever it is, it's an animal, isn't it? Animals don't like noise, don't like fire, don't like being made to feel like the little one in the room." "Ross," Sarah's voice had an edge to it. "Did you see the door?" "I saw the door. I'm not saying I want to shake its hand. I'm saying if we can put the scare into it, chase it off the ridge, maybe it doesn't come back tonight at all, and maybe the weather's cleared by tomorrow and none of this matters anyway." Duncan, to his own later regret, backed him. He would say afterward, though they were doing precious little afterward left for him to say it in, that it had felt, at the same time, like doing something, and doing something had felt a great deal better than sitting by the fire, listening to sleet and waiting for dark. The two of them argued the group round to it in the end. They would go out together, stick close to the bothy, make noise, throw a few stones if it came to that, and come straight back in at the first sign of anything larger than a fox. 20 minutes, no more. Elizabeth did not want Duncan to go. She said so, plainly, more than once. And he kissed her on the top of her head, and told her he'd rather be doing something with his hands shaking than sitting still with them shaking, and that if it came to nothing, they'd all have a laugh about it over dinner. It did not come to nothing. The two men went out into the failing afternoon light, with a pan lid apiece, and Ross's climbing axe held loosely in one hand, more for the reassurance of holding something than any real belief that it would be needed. And the door was pulled shut behind them, and the four of them who remained sat close together by the fire and tried, with limited success, to talk about anything else. For perhaps 10 minutes there was nothing to hear beyond the wind. Then, faint at first, they heard the two men's voices outside, shouting, banging the pan lids together, the ordinary rough noise of two people trying to sound bigger and braver than they felt. It went on for a while. It was, Sarah would say later, almost working, almost starting to feel like the exercise in nothing that Ross had promised it would be. Then the sound changed. It was not a scream at first. It was a single word, Duncan's voice, cut off almost before it began, a warning, or the start of one, swallowed whole before the second syllable. Then it was a scream, and it did not sound like Duncan any longer. It did not, in the strictest sense, sound entirely human. A note in it too high, too raw, a sound wrenched out of the body rather than spoken by one. And it lasted, according to every account given afterward, no more than 3 or 4 seconds before it stopped. It did not fade, it did not trail away, it simply stopped, the way a recording stops when the tape is cut. Inside the bothy, 4 people were on their feet before the sound had even finished. Elizabeth already moving to the door with a wordless, animal sound of her own rising in the throat. And it was only Fiona and Callum together who managed to catch her, hold her, keep her from the door by main force, while Sarah stood frozen at the window, staring out into the grey wall of sleet that showed her nothing at all. Then the door burst inward. Ross came through it, moving in a way that none of them had ever seen a person move, half run, half fall, one arm clamped tight across his own chest, blood soaking dark through the torn fabric at his shoulder, his face white as the sleet outside, and his eyes wide with a kind of blank, animal terror that none of them had words for. He hit the floor hard, scrambling backwards across the flagstones on his good arm until his back struck the wall, and then he simply screamed. It took Sarah and Callum both, kneeling either side of him, gripping his face, saying his name over and over, a full minute to get anything coherent out of him. It took him, Ross said, when the words finally came, and they came in the broken rush, half swallowed by sobbing. It took him. It had been before I didn't even see it move. 1 second he's next to me, and the next he's gone by. It tore him apart. It tore him apart right in front of me, and it wasn't even trying. It wasn't even trying. Ross, what was it? What did you see? I don't know. It was fast. It was so fast and big, and it was so big, and it just... He stopped, retched, pressed the heel of his good hand hard against his eyes, as though he could physically push the images back out of them. It didn't even look at me. I don't understand. It just took him and it was gone, into the sleet, gone, and I ran. I just ran and I ran. I left him out there. Elizabeth had gone very still in Fiona's arms. She said nothing at all. She simply stared at the closed door and then, slowly, sank down to sit on the cold flagstones and did not move again for a long time. Outside, the light was already failing, and the grey afternoon sliding toward the black and howling dark, and beyond the door, beyond the ruined, unrepairable door that no longer closed properly on its frame, the storm went on exactly as it had all day, indifferent to what had just allowed to happen, giving up not one single degree of its fury to mark the fact that a man had died 20 feet from where his friends now sat. Nobody went out to look for Duncan's body. Nobody needed to be told why. They barricaded the door as best they could. The table dragged across it. The 2 benches stacked on top. Every heavy thing in the bothy piled against the frame that could no longer properly latch, and built the fire up until the single long room was almost too warm, as though the heat itself might be some kind of ward. Nobody spoke very much. Ross's shoulder, once they had got torn jacket away from it, proved to be a deep, ragged gash rather than the wound they had all feared. Long, clearly the mark of a single raking claw, but not so deep as to hit anything vital. More the wound of something that had swiped at him in passing, in pursuit of the man beside him, than something that had ever meant to take Ross at all. They cleaned it, and bound it with what remained of the first aid kit, and Ross sat afterward with his back at the wall, staring at nothing, saying almost nothing. The blank 1,000-yard look of a man who understands he only survived because something else was standing closer. Elizabeth sat, apart from the rest of them, wrapped in every spare layer they had, her face unreadable in the firelight. Sarah stayed close to her without saying much of anything at all, because there was, in truth, nothing at all worth saying, and she seemed to, on some level, understand that. "We need a plan," Fiona said eventually. Quietly, more to break the silence than because she believed that there was a plan worth having. "For the moment, for the morning, if the weather breaks even a little, we go, all 5 of us. Together we move fast, and we don't stop for anything." "And if it doesn't break?" Callum asked. Nobody answered. They took it in turns to keep watch through the evening, though watch, in truth, amounted to little more than sitting close to the fire, with eyes that would not stay properly open, listening to a wind that never once let up, and a sleet that ticked against the windows with the patient regularity of a clock counting down to something none of them wanted to name. It was some time past midnight. Nobody could afterward agree exactly when, that the howling started. It began far off, carried thin and strange on the wind, and for every moment every one of them held perfectly still, straining to hear it. It was not the howl of any dog, nor any wolf. Not that any of them could properly claim to know what a wolf sounded like outside of a documentary. It rose in a long climbing note that had unmistakably woven through it something almost human, a cry with grief in it, or rage, or both together, twisting up into a register that scraped at something old and animal in the base of every listening skull, before falling away into a low, guttural series of coughing barks that rolled off across the glen and slowly faded. It came again perhaps 20 minutes later, then again, later still, always from somewhere out on the high ground, always distant. Never, as far as any of them could judge, drawing any closer to the Bothy itself. "It's not coming for us," Sarah whispered at one point, into the long stretch of silence between cries. "It's, I don't know, mourning, or hunting something else. It's not close." Nobody found the observation especially comforting, not with what happened not 12 hours before, but it was, at least, true. Whatever moved out there in the dark and the sleet, crying its strange half-human cry across the empty glen, it did not come to the door again that second night. The 5 of them sat huddled around a fire that none of them fed with any less urgency for the fact, and somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning, Exhaustion finally, mercifully, overcome terror, and each of them slept in short broken snatches, sitting upright, never quite letting go of whatever they had chosen in the dark to hold on to. Dawn, when it finally came, brought no relief at all. If anything, the storm had worsened overnight. The wind now a constant driving roar rather than the gusty battery of the day before, and the sleet had thickened further still, riding in almost sideways past the small windows, and broken from the world, had reduced itself to a formless grey nothing in which even the near slope of the glen was only intermittently visible. Callum went to the door, carefully, one hand on the piled furniture, and eased it open a crack to look out, and was answered immediately by a blast of freezing air and dry and driven ice that made him shove it closed again within seconds. "We're not walking anywhere in that," he said, and nobody argued with him, because nobody needed to. They spent the morning doing small useless things that people do when there's generally nothing productive left to be done. Rationing what remained of the food, refilling water from the burn in short, awful dashes around that nobody wanted to make and everybody knew had to be made, checking Ross's shoulder, checking the barricaded door, checking their phones for a signal that never came. Lisbeth spoke perhaps a dozen words all morning. Ross sat mostly still, favouring his bad arm, his eyes going often and without his apparent noticing to the door, as though he expected it to be open again at any moment on its own. By early afternoon it was clear, in a way that none of them wanted to say aloud, that a third night was no longer a possibility to be planned around, but a certainty to be endured. The weather showed no sign whatsoever of breaking. The light was already beginning its early winter fade by 3:30, and 11 miles of pathless, flooded, storm-lashed hillside stood between them and the cars, regardless of what waited or did not wait along the way. Nobody suggested going out. Nobody needed to. "One more night," Fiona said, into the grey afternoon light, in a voice that's someone trying to convince herself of something she doesn't believe. "The forecast has to break eventually. One more night and then we go, whatever it takes." Sarah reached over and took her hand, and did not say what all of them were quietly, privately thinking. That the thing that had taken Duncan had not, on the previous night, come near the Bothy at all, had cried its strange grieving cry from somewhere far off on the tops, and never once approached, and that there was no reason at all, none, to assume that it would be so restrained again. They fortified the door as best as they could once more, dragging every remaining piece of heavy furniture against it, wedging the legs of the table into the gaps the claws had torn, and as the light finally failed entirely outside, the 5 of them settled in around the fire to wait out the night that none of them, if they were honest to themselves, expected at all to survive. They were right not to expect it. For the first several hours of the third night, there was nothing. No scratching at the door, no distant, grieving howl carried by the wind. Only the storm itself, roaring unabated outside, and the low crack and settle of the fire, and 5 people sitting close together in a silence too heavy for words, each of them straining, despite themselves, to hear past the wind for anything at all. It was Lisbeth, quiet, watchful Lisbeth, who had barely spoken in 2 days, who heard it first. "Listen," she said, very softly. They listened. Beneath the wind, faint but unmistakable, came a sound none of them had heard before. Not the scratch of claws on wood, not the far-off howl, but something slower, heavier, deliberate. Footsteps. If the word could be stretched to cover a stride that long, moving in a slow circuit around the outside of the Bothy, pausing every so often, as though listening in turn. The footsteps stopped outside the door. For a long moment, nothing happened at all. Then, low and patient, the scratching began again, Not frantic this time, not testing, but purposeful, working at the same deep gouges from 2 nights before, as though continuing an interrupted task. The barricaded table groaned against the frame. "It's not going to stop," Ross said, very quietly, his voice flat with a kind of exhausted certainty. "It knows we're in here. It's not going to stop until it's in." The first window went without warning. It was a smaller window, on the gable end nearest the old byre, and it did not simply break, it exploded inward in a shower of old glass and splintered frame. And through the ragged hole came an arm, if arm was even a word for it, pale, sinewed, far, far too long for any body that must have belonged to, ending in a hand that had 4 fingers, each tipped with a curved black claw the length of a kitchen knife. It closed around Sarah's ankle before she could even scream. She went backward off her feet, dragged bodily across the flagstones towards the broken window, clawing at the floor, at the leg of the overturned bench, at anything that might hold her, and Callum and Ross were both on her in an instant, hauling back against a grip that did not so much as slow. It was not enough. It was nowhere near enough. There was a single, terrible sound of tearing fabric and worse, and then Sarah was gone through the window into the dark, and her scream, brief and then not, was swallowed almost instantly by the storm outside, as though the night itself had simply closed over her. Fiona was screaming Sarah's name. Lisbeth had gone to the far wall, pressed flat against it, one hand clamped over her own mouth. Ross stood frozen, staring at the broken window, at the blood already freezing black on its jagged frame, and it was in that moment of stillness, of everyone for one fatal second simply staring, that the second window went. It took Lisbeth before any of them could move at all. There had been 3 of them left now, Callum, Fiona and Ross, backed into the corner of the room, farthest from the broken window, the fire guttering behind them. And it was through the ruined gable window, in the brief stuttering of light of the dying flames, that Callum finally saw it properly for the first time. It filled the broken frame the way nothing built by human hands should ever fill anything. The shape of it was, in its bones, almost human. A torso, a head, 2 arms and 2 legs in roughly the arrangement God gave to men, and that was, somehow, the very worst part of it, because everything about the proportions had been taken and stretched and wrung out until the resemblances became an obscenity rather than a comfort. The arms hung far past the knees where they should have been, ending in those long curved claws. The legs bent wrong, doubled at a second joint no human leg possesses, built for a gait no human gait resembles. The skin, where it could be called skin at all, was pale and hairless in patches, and matted with something like fur in others, stretched taut over a frame of visible, wrong-angled bone. And the face. The face had, once, unmistakably, been a human face. You could see it in the arrangement of it, in the ghost of a jaw, in something that might once have been a nose, but it had been dragged somehow into something else entirely. The jaw lengthened and widened into something closer to a muzzle, lined with teeth too many and too long for any mouth to properly close around, and above it, a small and black and utterly coldly aware 2 eyes that fixed on Callum from across the ruined room with an intelligence that no animal in this country had any right to. It did not look otherworldly the way a monster in a story looks otherworldly. It looked like something that had once been a man and had been made, by some cruelty older than any of them could name, into something that resembled dimly that it had once been. It came through the window in a single motion, too fast to properly follow, and Ross, brave, foolish, and already broken Ross, threw himself between it and Fiona with nothing but his bare hands raised, and it did not so much as pause. One long arm swept out, almost lazily, and Ross was simply gone from where he had been standing, thrown bodily against the far wall with a sound that ended everything he might otherwise have said or done for the rest of his life. Fiona screamed and ran from the barricaded door, tearing at the furniture piled against it with her hands that no longer seemed to belong to her, and Callum was screaming her name, reaching for her, and the creature crossed the room between one heartbeat and the next. He never saw exactly what happened to her. He would, in the very short time he had left to think about anything at all, be grateful for that. What Callum did in the end, he did without any decision at all, in the animal, thoughtless way that a body sometimes acts faster than the mind attached to it. The door hung half open on its ruined hinges where Fiona's last desperate effort had dragged the barricade aside, and he was through it and out into the storm before he could consciously understand that he was moving. Sleet driving into his face, and the roar of the wind swallowing every sound from the bothy behind him, and he ran. He did not choose a direction. There was no direction to choose, no path, no landmark, nothing in the driving dark and sleet but the vague downhill pull of the land under his boots. And he followed it blindly, lungs burning, legs screaming, not once looking back at the low stone building he was leaving behind, because looking back would have meant knowing for certain what he already knew. He ran until it became something closer to stumbling, and stumbling becomes something closer to walking, his body simply unable to sustain anymore, cold and wet and utterly spent, the storm no longer something he was fleeing so much as something he had become part of. He had no idea how far he had come, or in what direction or for how long he had been moving. The dark had a formless to it now, and felt less like night and more like inside of something, and the wind had a voice in it, distant and constant, that he had stopped being entirely sure was only wind. He stopped, finally, because his legs would carry him no further, and stood swaying in the driving sleet on some nameless slope in the dark, and understood, with a strange floating clarity that felt almost like peace, that he had nowhere left to run, and no strength left to run with, and that it did not, in the end, matter very much which direction he had chosen. Somewhere, ahead of him in the dark, carried on the wind, came a cry. It rose in that same terrible half-human register he had heard the night before from far across the glen, except that now there was no distance in it, none at all. It was not far off, and it would not soften. And Callum understood, in the last clear thought he would ever have, that in his blind directionless flight through the storm, he had run not away from the thing that hunted him, but straight toward it. He did not run again. There was, by then, nowhere left for him to run from. The cry came again, closer, and then closer still, and then it did not need to travel any further at all. In the small stone bothy above a nameless glen in the far north of Scotland, the storm blew on through what remained of the night, and by morning, when it last broke, there was no one left alive to see the sun come up over Cairn lawn.